Hello, I'm Michael McMullan. Welcome once again to the WPBSA official podcast. And as you'll clearly know by now, last Friday we lost an absolute giant of the game with the news that Clive Everton had passed away at the age of 87. And understandably, all the tributes, I think, have focused primarily on his role as one of the great commentators, and the term trailblazer gets thrown around so easily these days, but it was so true in Clive's case because he was so much more than a commentator. And I think a lot of people perhaps aren't even really aware of just how big a role Clive played in getting the game as we know it off the ground. And then, in a sense, saving it from itself with his campaigning through snooker scene, which I think played a really big part in where the professional game is at now. And there really could be no two better people to discuss all this with than Phil Yates and Dave Hendon. And that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to start with you, Phil, because you knew him longer than either Dave or I did. So tell us about the first time you met Clive.
Well, I actually saw him play, but didn't meet him a few years before I had our first chat. Our first official chat was also our first sort of meeting. It was September 1988, and I've got a couple of mutual friends of mine, both former Midland amateur snooker champions, Stan Bate and Les Adams, who knew Clive well. And they also knew that he needed a junior. Now, at the time, I was 26. I decided to try and go into journalism, but really the path was unknown to me. And so luckily for me, Stan and Les said, why don't you go and see Clive Everton? So I drove up from my house, which isn't too far away from his offices in Birmingham as they were then. Walked into the office and I was so nervous because even then I held him in very high regard because I read Snooker Scene all the time and listened to him on TV. And as soon as I walked in and the interview began, after a couple of minutes, I realised that the funny figure that I thought he was actually just a really friendly bloke. And we got on immediately. It must have been the only interview in history where at the end of it, the interviewer was asked for his autograph. I asked him to sign a book for me. And from then on, a 36-year relationship began. And I can honestly say this, and this is absolutely the truth. There were times where I was a little bit irritated by the fact he'd ring me up late at night or ask me to do something when I'd been working for weeks on end or things like that. But I can honestly say, in 36 years of working with him, we never had one single crossword.
What about you, Dave?
Well, I wrote to Clive when I'd done my A-levels. It's that time when you're waiting for your results and then going to university. And because I still do in the Midlands, quite close to where his office was, I wrote to him, it was in the summer, it would have been 17, 18, to see if I could do any work experience. Because I was quite naive about I thought my only sort of understanding of sort of newspapers and magazines were from films, and I always thought they were a massive hive of activity and typewriters going and people running around. I thought, oh, this would be great. What a maelstrom to be part of. Anyway, he wrote back. It was he sent a postcard back. It was a typical sort of Clive sort of line. He said the problem is it's the summer and right now there isn't a lot of work to experience because obviously there were no tournaments. There was nothing really happening. But I actually, the first time I met Phil because I went to the qualifiers and sort of saw what it was all about there. So by the time I met him, I was actually working in snooker. I was working with the WPBSA as a junior press officer. So I met him at a tournament, and you talk now about, and I'm sure if people come to a tournament, they see like Ronnie O'Sullivan or Jimmy White or Stephen Hendry. Oh wow, an absolute legend, and of course they are. But when Clive walked into the press room the first time, that's what I felt. I'd listened to him, I'd read his words, I always trusted his opinions, and suddenly there he was, incredibly friendly. The thing with Clive, and funny enough, a friend of ours, Ivan Hersovich, head of media at World Snooker Tour, he wrote a piece on the website. He put his own sort of tribute, and he made the point when he first went to a tournament as a journalist, Clive spoke to him. And the moment he knew that he was passionate about snooker, he was happy to chat. He said, come and sit by me. And that's the thing. If he knew you were a genuine snooker fan, he would love to speak to whoever you were. And like Phil, we had a very good relationship. I didn't agree with every single opinion he had, but I never had a crossword with him at all because you had to respect his absolute passion for the game.
I think, Phil, what he was obviously best known for, as I said earlier, was the BBC commentary. And we'll talk about that, of course. And that started at very short notice. I think he was told about 20 minutes before he went on in the late 70s. But you would know, Phil, having been around at the time, he was already a very big figure within the game before he had uttered one line of commentary for the BBC.
Absolutely. Obviously, starting snooker scene in 1972, that made him an influential figure anyway, because back then that was the magazine you read, and now, 52 years later, it remains so. He'd done other commentaries as well, so he knew exactly what the score was, but getting the BBC was the big thing for him, and it remained so throughout his life. And when he lost the BBC, I think of all the things that happened to him in his career, and of course he had setbacks, many of which were no fault of his own, I think losing the BBC was the greatest setback for him. He couldn't quite work out why, because Clive believed strongly in the value of meritocracies. And it was quite obvious that when he and the BBC parted company, he was still absolutely excellent. There was no reason in terms of how good he was at his job for him to leave.
Let's talk about the impact he had on so many people's lives, Dave, because he was really the person who invented the idea of snooker journalism. And this is something he recounted a number of times over the years, that he was almost ridiculed for the idea that snooker journalism and snooker media was something that you could make a living out of. Now, of course, he proved everybody wrong and made a very comfortable living out of it. So all those of us who have followed after, he really was, in a genuine sense of the word, a trailblazer for us.
Totally. I mean, he had, a lot of sort of difficulty getting people interested in snooker sort of in the pre-TV age. Really, before Alex Higgins won the 72 World Championship, he rang up, I think it was the Daily Telegraph, trying to get them interested in snooker. And they said they'd only take a piece on the World Championship, and only if it was played in London. I mean, that was the kind of the attitude of the time that he was up against. And in a way, you can understand it, because it didn't really have, it was played widely, but it was played largely by working class people, and it was kind of a subculture. It wasn't until obviously Pot Black and as Alex Higgins winning. And of course, that was the time, just around that time, that he started Snooker Scene, and Snooker Scene became, the great journal of the game. But yeah, he was absolutely at the forefront of that and made it credible, actually, because he wasn't just writing about snooker, he was writing about it in such an intelligent way. He was actually lifting the sport out of its sort of the way people perceived it as, a game played by ne'er-do-wells in smoky halls, all of that nonsense. Actually writing about it intelligently, and writing about not only the game intelligently, but the structure of the sport as well, giving that credibility. And that's his great legacy for me, actually, is that Snooker Scene archive. You go back and read some of those early editions, you see the way the sport grew. And to a large degree, of course, it grew because he was chronicling the fact that it was growing.
I think there was one other newspaper said to him, well, we want the copy by 4:30, and preferably if there's a row involved, so much the better. Maybe paraphrasing slightly, but something along those lines.
Times haven't changed in that case, have they?
Well, yeah, actually true, maybe even more so. But Dave talked there, Phil, about the growth of the game, and Clive was very, very pleased to see that, obviously. I think both of you probably over the years have described him as an evangelist for the game. It's certainly a word that's been thrown around. So he was delighted to see how it boomed. But he became increasingly frustrated, Phil, didn't he, with how that boom was being squandered?
Absolutely, yeah. It was an ongoing thing for him in the 70s. That was when the game started to show signs of life. Then in the 80s came the big bang, the boom that I think surprised everyone. Then in the 90s and the 2000s, that was when the great boom was being squandered, as you say. And we thought at one point, with the low number of tournaments and the falling viewing figures, that maybe all of Clive's work might come to naught in the end, because it looked as though the circuit, maybe not dying, but certainly on life support. And Clive, being the evangelist he was for what's right and for the best political solutions, the best commercial solutions, and the best pragmatic solutions to snooker's many problems, cost himself personally an awful lot, financially as well as anything else, by having these principles, which, since Barry Hearn took over, have proved to be absolutely correct. The one thing is, if you live a life and it ends and your stance is vindicated. And what you've done is totally justified. Then you can say you've lived a good life. And I think that's the best thing that we can say about Clive. When he left us, how much better was snooker off than it was when he started these campaigns? It was quite clear, and I don't think he ever did anything because he disliked people personally. Obviously, he did dislike people personally, some of them, but that wasn't his motivation for starting these campaigns. It was to make snooker better. And ultimately, what happened when Barry came in, it became exponentially better. And that's one of the things I'm really happy about, because in the last sort of 20% of his life, Clive, in terms of snooker politics, had what he always desired, which was A, growth, B, evolution, and C, peace.
And you talk about people who speak truth to power. That's a phrase that's often used. And nobody did that more than Clive, Dave. Problem is, of course, power in many cases doesn't like having truth spoken to it. And it led to all sorts of dirty tricks and petty behaviour. And sometimes it just got so farcical you just had to laugh. And one of the first tournaments that we were all at together was the 1998 UK Championship in Bournemouth. And if I mention chickens to you, Dave, what does that remind you of?
Yeah, well, they were very sneaky because they gave Clive honorary billiards membership, which, it seems a small thing, doesn't it? But of course, what that meant was he didn't have to apply for membership. He was given honorary membership, but of course they could take that away as well. And so that's what they did. So because he wasn't a member, they said, "Oh, you're not allowed in the building." Now, of course, he was working for the BBC. But the BBC quite rightly said, "Well, he's working for us. He will come in the building." But what it meant was he couldn't go in any other parts of the building other than the commentary box. So he was sponsored by Liverpool Victoria, and it was a chicken was their kind of logo. And there was a row of chickens that were just on the carpet as a sort of, sponsorship thing. And yeah, he did the chicken run. He had to follow the chicken to the commentary box. I mean, the petty doesn't even begin to cover it. It shows, how sort of just ridiculous it all was, really. The fact that the problem that they had with Clive was that he was so often actually right. If he was wrong or made stuff up, they could sue him and take him to court. They never successfully sued him. That's one of the reasons that sort of crowd didn't like him. It's because he was speaking truth. And the easiest thing for Clive, certainly in the 1980s, to have done would actually just to have ridden the wave with them. He filled his boots and not said a word, and that's what a lot of people did. But that's just not what he was like. But yeah, that ban. I mean, it's actually crazy. Looking back, and he was still having to do work for the Guardian, and of course they weren't happy. And for a sport to sideline probably its only known media figure, looking back, is absolute madness.
It's appropriate that it was chickens, given that he liked to ruffle a few feathers in the game. But let's talk then about what it was about Clive and his commentary, Phil. How would you sum it up, as someone who probably heard as much of it as anyone, really, and obviously learned from it too? What would you say was the essence of why it was so great and why so many people loved his style?
Well, obviously, nowadays, even all these years later, there is, with certain stations, the lead commentator and then the analyst. And I think that is tried and tested. It remains the best way to go. Clive, of course, because he was a very good cueman in snooker and billiards, understood the game immensely. So he could be a perfectly adequate analyst. But he was also an absolutely tremendous lead. So he got the knowledge of the game, the journalistic nous, and I think the biggest thing of the lot, the thing he threw in the pot that made Clive not just good, but magical. He was a terrific wordsmith. Now, you put all that into a mixture and then add the pixie dust of total timing. That was Clive. His timing was, I think, better than anyone who's ever commentated on the game before or since.
And I think, Dave, a lot of the time, you look back on some of the expressions that he used that were particularly well known, they're not maybe even that out of the ordinary. But Clive could say the most ordinary thing, and he'd say it with that timing that Phil talks about, and just the gravitas that he had earned over so many years. it just seemed to mean so much more coming from him than if someone else had said it.
Yeah, I think he was one of the few commentators who you were waiting to hear what they were going to say. You're waiting to hear how he would wrap it up. And yeah, that use of vocabulary, that intelligence that I mentioned earlier on, and the restraint, really, having the confidence not to say too much. It was a different time. I mean, he was actually in the 80s. The BBC constantly told him he was over talking, which seems ridiculous now. You listen back to it, but they had a very strict policy about how much talking there was. So in a way, his style was sort of forced on him a little bit, but it became what he was known for. And like I say, he never felt ever like he was talking for the sake of it. When he was speaking, it was something worth listening to, a bit like, I would say Richie Benaud in cricket. I mean, that cricket commentary has completely changed now, but when he was doing it, it was exactly the same. You were waiting to hear what he would say because you knew that it carried weight.
It's ironic, Phil, and I think we were discussing this the other day. A lot of people saw Clive as the ultimate establishment figure. Now, I mean, I don't think any perception of anyone has ever been more wrong. And a word that you use a lot to describe him, Phil, is irreverent in his sense of humour. And I think that was summed up more than ever by the cover of Snooker Scene one particular December.
That's right, yeah. It was when the political problems were at their height. And it made me laugh. It makes me laugh to this day because it just, right down my street, he said, "A Merry Christmas to most of our readers." Now, that was funny, but the follow-up the following year was even funnier because some of the problems have been ironed out and some of the enemies of the previous year weren't around anymore. But there were still a few in existence that were lingering around. And Clive's follow-up for the December issue of the following year was, "A Merry Christmas to the overwhelming majority of our readers." Now, anyone who can have that kind of sense of humour, he's got my vote.
And he ran that magazine for so many years and ran, let's not say a media empire, but well, let's actually call it that, a small media empire, Dave. And it's amazing that he managed to do it for so long while being so set in his ways, in a nice way, I mean. And really, when it came to the IT revolution, Dave, for Clive, that was just sort of something that happened to other people.
Yeah, I mean, he was old school with technology because obviously that's how he'd been brought up. Everything was handwritten. He would sort of write out his editorial, and then the various secretaries would type them up. I mean, his commitment to the magazine was extraordinary. Literally the day after the World Championship, bearing in mind he would have been at the Crucible basically 18 days, get there the day before, 18 days, working all day, commentating, radio, newspapers. You'd think you might have a couple of days off. He'd be back in the office on the Tuesday morning, getting the magazine ready. Yeah, I mean, he when he did his newspaper stuff, he would always read it over to copy takers, which quite often improvising it because he'd just come out of the commentary box. There wasn't time to write it properly. And then there'd be all sorts of scream ups the next day about how garbled it had been, put in the Guardian. He would always get the Guardian and say, "Let's see what they've done to me." That would be his comment.
Let's see what the G have done to me.
Exactly. Yeah. And but that was because obviously he couldn't sort of. I mean, he had to, in the end, when they got rid of copy takers, he had to learn how to send an email. But I mean, he literally had to be given written instructions, and invariably, someone like Ivan, who we mentioned, would have to basically do it for him. Yeah, but I find that quite refreshing in a way that he sort of just ignored the entire sort of development of technology and just did it how he'd always done it.
I remember walking into the press room at the Crucible the first morning of the 2011 World Final, and Ted Lowe's death had come through to us that morning, and Clive had to write a big obituary. I presume that was for the Guardian, and he had only just started having to actually learn how to type and send it himself. So I think I walked in the press room about 10 that morning. He was already working on it. He effectively missed the first day of the World Final because he was still typing away at about 9 o'clock that night. Very quick in thinking, not so quick at getting those words onto the page. And Phil, I thought, and I'm sure you'd agree, it was great, wasn't it, that we were all together last Friday? Because I found out the news. I came down to breakfast in the hotel Friday morning in Cheltenham, and you told me, and we all knew it was coming. But it was wonderful that you and me and Dave and some of the players who knew him well and had worked with him were all together on Friday and just sitting around telling stories and laughing our heads off about it all. And Clive just loved that scene. He loved being part of that conviviality at tournaments.
That's what made me the saddest, the fact we were all there and he wasn't. Because that was his scene. I said that today. We were in the press room. We were not being sad. We were having all those stories and all those reminiscences about the different aspects of his life and what he'd done and how he'd made us laugh over the years, and he would have loved to have been there. You know, one of the things with Clive, and Dave will definitely agree with this, he put an awful lot of work into obituaries of other people because I think he felt a responsibility to reflect their lives accurately and also with a sort of entertaining value, if you like, you know, to make people read these pieces because he wanted people to know what these particular people had done in their own lives. And that's why I think it's a responsibility of ours to say what Clive was like. Now, we're very lucky in our profession. We see public figures in a private environment, and sometimes public perceptions don't match up with actuality. And I think Clive was like that. As you say, he was regarded as very much establishment. And I think that was because of the way maybe he spoke and the way he dressed, but that wasn't the case at all. He was very liberal in his politics. He was left-leaning, not politically correct in the strictest sense, I suppose, but such good fun, very hard-working. And I think the other important thing to say about Clive was he didn't just love snooker and billiards, he loved sport. He was a national hockey selector for a time. He always kept abreast of the football scores. I think he was a West Bromwich Albion fan like myself. He was good enough to play for Worcestershire at tennis for over a decade. He played in Wimbledon qualifying. He beat some good players of the time. And so towards the end of his life, he spent an awful amount of his time watching tennis. So it wasn't just snooker and billiards he was interested in, it was other sports. But of course, there's a big difference between interest and obsession. And he was, in the very best sense of the word, obsessed with cue sports.
He loved when people from the wider world came to tournaments, didn't he, Dave? And we all remember that day. It was like something from a wonderful work of fiction, a Woodhouse novel or something, when a Canadian academic came to research a book he was working on. And it's fair to say Clive really gave him a welcome and enjoyed the validation, not just for the game, but a little bit for Clive as well.
Yeah, well, he did have a sort of hinterland. He was well read. He was interested in literature, and whenever someone like this, Mordecai Richler, you're talking about, whenever someone like that would come in, he would always the same comment. He would say, "Come into Intellectuals Corner." That was what we called like anyone sort of highbrow as the snooker would come and sort of sit down with Clive. Yeah, he was fascinated by those sort of guys because he was a very intelligent man himself. And just on what you were talking about there. The fact we were together last week, and it's true, he would have loved that. He was always the first person in the press room every day. Like, you'd never get there before him. He couldn't wait to get down there. It was his domain. He would start to think about his commentary very early, you know, what he was going to say, what the match meant. You know, he would be thinking, Neil Folger said, you know, you could never beat him into the commentary box. He would always be there getting ready, preparing impeccably. And I think that's a journalistic thing. It's just about thinking about words. Ironically, he wouldn't use that many words, but he would have thought a lot about the words he was going to use. But yeah, he was fascinated by. I mean, we had Terence Stamp come one year. We've had all sorts of people come, and they all knew Clive. That's the thing. If they were interested in snooker, they knew him. They were interested in talking to him, you know, finding out his views. And he enjoyed that as well because, as I say, although he was obsessed with snooker, he did have these sort of other interests as well.
And one point I made, Dave, the other day about Clive and all the reaction there's been to him, not just now, but in recent years, it was very significant, actually, that when Judd Trump had some comments to make about 3 years ago about where the game was going and the style of commentary, you would think someone like Judd, who's young and fashionable, he'd be wanting to go down some modern direction. But the one person he mentioned as someone we needed to have back in a more prominent role was Clive. You talk about speaking to all generations. What greater proof could there be of it than that?
That's right, yeah. I think he had a sort of a universal appeal. I mean, Neil Robertson told a lovely story about he thought Clive and David Attenborough were the same person because he thought the voice was quite similar, and he'd never seen a picture of Clive. And obviously, you know, in Australia, they got the BBC sort of wildlife programs. But in a way, you know, he is that sort of figure, isn't he? You know, he does have that gravitas, and I think, like you say, that universal respect, even for new players. Because I think that, you know, they've grown up listening, and no doubt, you know, anyone who's ever played snooker has done. Put it this way: anyone who's ever potted a black in a snooker club has done the Dennis Taylor finger wag and the cue waving, but also has imagined, you're winning the World Championship, and you're imagining Clive or Ted or one of those guys, what they're going to say as you do it. It's natural. And I think, I think that he did appeal to all ages.
And what impact do you feel he had, Phil, that even resonates to today on the way lead commentary is now done by the likes of yourself and Dave and Philip Studd and myself and other people who do it? How do you feel his style has been reflected in all of that, even up to today?
Well, from my personal point of view, I can't speak for anyone else, although I think Dave has exactly the same approach as I do. I do an awful lot of research beforehand, and I think that's really important. It's a safety net for me, but it's also an ability to come out with facts when they're required, and that's what Clive drummed into me. Also, I think the fact that he hated making mistakes. He despised it. I remember at an early World Championship, he'd made a very small one. It was something like, in and out, he'd said that somebody had made an 88 break and it was an 89. Something as minor as that. And he came out and he was shaking his head. And I couldn't quite understand why he was so upset. Mm. But of course, having done the role myself now for all these years, I'm exactly the same. Mm. When there is a mistake made, and I know it, even though it's an absolutely minuscule mistake that probably no one would notice apart from you, Michael, I still feel really guilty about it.
Regularly, yeah.
Exactly. I know, yeah, exactly. I sometimes I think, why did I do that? And I just cannot get it off my head. And I think that was the legacy of being, mentored by Clive, who was, a man for, yes, he loved the artistry of snooker, but he also loved the accuracy of it. And I think he felt as though when he was in the commentary box, he should be accurate as well.
You mentioned Dennis there, Dave, and in something else earlier in this, you talked about how Clive always knew the score. Now, I know you didn't mean that in a literal sense, but if we're going to use that term, always knew the score in a literal sense, there was one day, I think it was around about the late 90s, where Clive, getting a bit confused about the score, almost had a very bad ending for Dennis. It's a famous story. It's been told so many times, but let's tell it one more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Dennis could tell it better than me, but they were commentating on quite an inconsequential match, I think, at the Grand Prix in Preston. And the worst thing I think you can do in commentary is lose your concentration. And if you lose it slightly, you will misread the score. And, maybe someone needs snookers or doesn't, and you get it the wrong way around. I think that happened. And he was Clive was sort of leaning back, as he was wont to do on his chair. And I think he did misread the score. So then he was trying to put himself right. Anyway, he's leaning back, and the inevitable happens. He finds himself sort of starting to go backwards. And I think his attitude was, if I'm going down, I'm taking Dennis with me. So he's grabbed Dennis by the tie. I mean, the fact that people are wearing ties in the commentary box is extraordinary. But anyway, he grabbed him by the tie and nearly strangled him. I mean, it's a fact. They had to cut the tie off in the end. But then, of course, this happened just as the frame was coming to an end. So he's had to sort of scramble up off the floor. And it's, Gary Wilkinson leads by 2 frames to 1 sort of thing. I mean, Dennis tells that story in a very funny way. I think that the camera guy on the top of the sort of gantry, as it were, the top above the box, said it was shaking because Clive was a big man, But thankfully, various tragedies were averted.
Yeah. Phil, you must have seen so many stories with Clive over the years. Tell us one.
Well, I mean, a funny story. Clive was another thing that we've got in common, by the way. We were both gluttons. He loved his food, and so do I. And he was particularly...
It's always a scramble to get to the buffet if you two were around. You had to be
absolutely,
in early to get your share, yeah.
You didn't really know it was going to be one or two, but you know it was going to be both of us. So basically, he loved puddings and sweets and all that kind of stuff. He got a particular affinity with profiteroles. I saw him, eat a dozen profiteroles in one sitting easily. I mean, that was just nothing for him. Mm. But the thing he was particularly enamored with and had a total weakness for was donuts. Anyway, one year we were in the office. It was early in my relationship with him, and we were putting together the match reports for the World Championship. And he's sitting there contemplating, funnily enough, leaning back on his chair as he was when he had that incident with Dennis. And he was eating a jam donut. Anyway, he bit into this with great gusto. And this geyser of strawberry jam went up in the air. So I'm sort of diagonal to him. I think, that's gone up in the air, but it's not come down. He's defied Isaac Newton here. Anyway, I'm thinking, where is this jam? I'm looking on the ceiling. I'm looking everywhere. I couldn't see it. 5 minutes later, it became apparent where it was. He's sort of rubbing his stomach as though he was some kind of lucky Buddha. And all of a sudden, his white shirt was absolutely covered in jam. And I'll never forget what he said. When, oh, I've had an incident. Yeah, now, if somebody had walked in, they might have thought he'd been shot, but it wasn't. It was strawberry jam. But yeah, Clive absolutely loved his food. And he loved it when we were at tournaments and the food was free. He loved that even more.
Even better. These are all very gentle stories, Dave, but there are some people, particularly people of Clive's standing, who mightn't actually like being told in any sort of mocking tone, any sort of stories about him. But he didn't take himself seriously in that way, did he? He loved joining in the joke as much as anyone, even if he was on the receiving end of it.
Definitely, I'll tell a story. I'm gonna clean it up because the actual story involves swearing, and I'm also not going to say who it's about. But basically, someone quite prominent died. And there was a program, probably still going, on Radio 4, very refined channel, Brief Lives.
Yeah.
And this producer rang up this young woman, and this person had died, and they wanted someone to go on and pay tribute, And obviously, she had no idea what Clive's relationship with this person was. She just assumed everyone was friends. So she rang up. I'll replace the swear word, with the word donut, okay? Which we just heard Bill talk about donuts. So she rang up and she said, so-and-so's died. Would you like to come on and say something? And there was like a pause. And Clive in commentary was great at the pause, but even in real life, he's probably even better at it. So there was a pause. And he said, well, he was one of the 5 biggest donuts I've ever known. And then there was another pause. And he said, is that the sort of thing you're after? And she said, well, not really. And that was the end of it. And bearing in mind, Clive, he enjoyed earning a living. He was turning down money to go on there, but he just couldn't bring himself to go on there. Speaking of money, also he's telling me in the sort of golden age of Pop Black, obviously Ted Lowe was the commentator, but they decided to have a feature one year, shot of the week. So they wanted basically Clive to identify a key shot and just briefly discuss it. And he asked what the fee was, and they said it'd be £25. And he thought, well, it's not a lot of money, every week, but it's not a lot of work really. I've just got to pick one shot. £25 a week. Okay, thank you very much. Got to the end of the series, and he was preparing the invoice, and he just sort of checked, all the details, and it turned out it was actually £25 for the series. So it was like a 15-part series, 25 quid. He still sent the invoice in, by the way.
That Brief Live story, by the way, if anyone ever sees us at a tournament, come up and ask us to tell, because then we'll be able to tell you, because it is a lot funnier when you can actually put the swear word in.
Another anecdote I must give you. Clive was rather absent-minded when he was driving, and he'd be talking about snooker inevitably and looking over at you if you're the passenger. And if he was doing that, he wouldn't see the speed sign. So there was one year where I think he'd had 3 speeding offences, and I think he got 9 points on his license at the time. And we were at the Grand Prix, I think it was in the October. It might have been the LG Cup, but that particular event. And John Parrott came in, and of course John Parrott was a big Everton fan, and they hadn't had the best of starts to the season. And Clive said, he said, I've been having some problems with my driving. He said, this Everton's got more points on his license than your football team. Which is, that was another typical one of him.
I remember actually being in the car with him, and the way you're in a car and there might be silence for a few minutes, and nobody likes that. So somebody tries to break it with something, and it might be a comment about the weather or whatever. But I remember Dave being in the car with him, me, you, and him one day, and there was a silence of about 30 seconds, and then he just broke the silence in his own way, in a way nobody else on earth would ever have done, by saying to you, what do you think about beneficiaries of the WPBSA Benevolent Fund being named publicly? I mean, what a conversation starter that is.
I was in the car with him one time. Sorry to interrupt. And there was a snooker documentary. Well, I think we were coming back from Crondon Park, the Championship League, and there was a snooker documentary on the BBC. And he said, "Oh, we'll have to listen to it," sort of thing. And it's about half an hour. We listened in absolute silence. I can't remember exactly what the sort of content was, but anyway, we listened in absolute silence, and the program ended. And Clive just said one word as he turned the radio off. He just said drivel. That was his only comment. He didn't say anything while it was on, and he never said anything more about it. He just said drivel.
Yeah. There was a new sports interviews series that was launched on one of the TV channels. I think it was while we were at the World Championship, and the next day people were talking about it because it had been really heavily publicised, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, I thought this was good and that was good." And someone asked Clive what he thought, and he just said, "Beautifully produced rubbish," and that was it. He didn't engage in any further discussion about it.
So one more thing,
course,
Michael, before we go on. The
Yeah.
thing with Clive was, and just on this theme of obsession, and by the way, there was no thought in his mind that he would have done anything inappropriate with this. It was 2 years ago, Christmas morning, 25 past 11. I remember the time because it was so preposterous. He rang me up, and I mentioned this during our RTV tribute. He rang me up, and he did say, "Merry Christmas," and "Merry Christmas, Clive, nice to hear from you, how you doing," and all this kind of stuff. And he went, "Can I ask you," and I'm thinking, he's going to come out with some sort of Christmas reminiscence or something. "Can I ask you?" And he wanted the provisional ranking of 2 players. Now, who wants the provisional ranking of 2 particular players at 25 past 11 on Christmas morning? And I thought, well, that summed up Clive and his total immersion in the sport more than anything.
Yeah. He probably didn't even need them for anything. That was just his way of celebrating Christmas. I think I'll ring Phil and get some provisional rankings off him. Most people just pull a cracker or whatever. But it's all about commentary, really, isn't it? He had a big impact on the game. We've not even mentioned the fact that he basically started the Masters 50 years ago now. But he will be remembered primarily for the commentary. So give us both of you a line, Dave. What line would you pick out from all the many famous ones that Clive uttered over the years?
Well, I don't know if it was famous or not, but it kind of sums up his entire approach to commentary. It was when he was coming to the end of his career at the BBC. It was World Championship. I can't remember what the match was, but it was quite close. It was quite a tense frame, and it was the crowd, as they are there, were absolutely wrapped up in it. So you could hear a pin drop, and the director put the camera on, just sort of panned across the crowd, and Clive said, "There's something special about a crucible silence." And I thought, wow, what a way to... I knew what he meant. If you're a snooker fan, you knew exactly what he meant by that. There's something special about a crucible silence. And that is a sort of classically understated but powerful line. Nothing more needs to be said after that.
I was thinking what line I'd pick out. I just can't. There are just so many of them. But just one that always comes to mind was the end of the 2005 World Championship. And it was amazing. Like Sean Murphy had won the World Championship. He was ranked 48 in the world. This sort of thing just didn't happen. Although, of course, something similar almost happened this year. We were only 4 frames away from it. And just when it ended, you might remember the exact words, Dave or Phil. I think it was amazing, astonishing, astounding.
Yeah.
That and it just summed the whole story up so well. And the other one as well was a couple of years before that, when Ken Doherty, good friend of all of us, who had all those amazing comebacks and almost ended up winning the World Championship in 2003. And it ended up losing out to Mark Williams. And Clive, again, summed it up perfectly right at the end. It's Williams's title, or maybe say, it's Williams's title. In many respects, it's been Doherty's championship. Brilliant. 2 weeks summed up in about 3 or 4 seconds. Incredible stuff. What about you, Phil?
Well, I just thought, talking there about Ken Doherty, Clive thought the world of Ken, as we all do. And it was really poignant on Friday that the first match we commentated on after we knew the news of his death was Dave Gilbert against Mark Selby. Again, really loved watching those 2 play. And indeed, Selby in the final as well against John Higgins. It was the stars aligned in that regard. And I think the line of commentary I remember is perhaps his most famous, talking about stars aligning. It was on a match involving Stephen Hendry and Ronnie O'Sullivan when he said, "It's snooker from the gods." Now, I think that match was a quarter of a century ago. And he was absolutely right, because in snooker terms, they are gods, aren't they? They remain, and there's still people who debate this, but they remain 1 and 2 on the all-time pecking order. And Clive knew it 25 years ago.
And I know, we'll all agree with this, and we're not just saying it because obviously they were paying us last week. I think we all agree the job that I think it was Martin Reardon did for ITV over the weekend. It was just so brilliant that Clive was so much a part of the coverage and all the tributes that were paid. And he put together a piece for the start of the final using old clips of Clive in terms of footage, but also in terms of audio, to almost make it seem as though Clive was still there previewing that day's final. it was just brilliantly done. And Clive would have loved all that. And you think back and the way he was, really bullied by so many people and put down, but was unshakable really in his belief for where the game needed to be going and what was holding it back. And it's just such a vindication of him that when he did pass away last week, he was celebrated so much. And it was just, well, to use another of his expressions, the storybook ending, really, from that point of view. Give us one final story then, guys. Dave, let's start with you. One last story to maybe sum up Clive and maybe have one last chuckle.
Well, it's quite a recent one. He rang up Cliff Thorburn a couple of years ago. And, obviously Cliff's out in Canada and, they were great friends. I mean, Cliff was a big admirer of Clive's. I think Cliff just thought it was a social call, but Clive wasn't big on that really. It was about work, and he rang him up and he was asking various questions. He said, "Can I just check your mother's maiden name?" And Cliff, it's almost like you're going through a security check with your bank. Your mother's maiden name. Anyway, so Cliff passed it on. He said, "Yeah, fine, Clive. This is what it is." He said, "What's all this for?" And again, I like to think there was a pause. Clive said, "I'm writing your obituary," and that's one thing he actually loved. He loved obituaries because he loved like the curiosity of other people's lives. As Phil said, get as much detail in as possible. He would often say, I think it's a phrase that he'd heard from a newspaper editor. He would often say when he was preparing the magazine, "Let's liven it up with a few obituaries." And he actually enjoyed writing them. So he got Cliff's, I mean, maybe, when the sad day comes that Cliff passes, that the obituary in The Guardian will actually have been written by Clive.
Yeah, fantastic. And what about you, Phil? What's one final story from you?
Well, when I was sitting with him for those hours on end in press rooms up and down the country, indeed, over the world, invalidating, by the way, my presence was invalidating Intellectuals Corner, but I was allowed in anyway. He once said to me, the reason I admire people is because they can do something that I can't. He vastly admired snooker players who were at the top of their games. He was fascinated by them. And I think this is my final story and also my final reflection on Clive. I think the reason I admired him so much, he did something that I couldn't do. I hate confrontation. He did as well, actually, but he'd still got the balls to confront power, even though he didn't want to do it because he didn't want to get involved in arguments and stress and aggro. He still did it because his hatred of confrontation was superseded by his love of the game.
Well, I remember when we'd finished all the tributes the other day, I said, I was on the ITVX commentary, and I said, if Clive was here, he'd be telling us just to get on with the commentary. And that's what we'll all do. And everything we do in snooker journalism that he paved the way for, I think we will all attempt the impossible task of living up to the incredible standards that he set for so long. And that is exactly the tribute he would most want us to pay to him.
Can I just sorry, Michael, can I just one final thing, because it's quite special to me. I started commentating the end of 2006, and Clive had sort of been part of that. He was down at Eurosport doing a billiards program, and Simon Reed, who was the head of commentators, because they were expanding the coverage, they only had 2 commentators at that point. And he said to him, "Do you know of anyone who might, if we expand the team, might be able to join us?" And Clive mentioned me. I went down and did a sort of audition as such. And then a couple of months later, I got my chance. And that was the UK Championship. Now, Clive, obviously, at the time was commentating himself on that. Then I did the Masters. He commentated on that. I think the Welsh Open. So by the time he actually heard me commentate, I think it was the Malta Cup, about the 4th event I'd done. He'd never sort of given me advice. I'd never asked for it as such. I felt, obviously, I'd listened to him and other people. I think you have to find your own way of doing it. But one morning, I got up a couple of days into the tournament, and there was a message on my phone, and it was Clive, and he just said some very nice things about how he thought I'd done well, and just he wasn't one for sort of massive overstatements, but just some very kind words. And I really wish I'd kept that now. Actually, you don't think at the time to do that, but that's how he was. We were never sort of overdone. He didn't, we never discussed it again, but it meant a lot that the best person ever to do that job had said something nice. That really encouraged me when I was starting out. Obviously I haven't done it very long then, to think that actually it could be, a career.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, Dave. You were still relatively new. You'd been working in snooker for not even a decade at that stage, and I always remember that because you and I both started out in the '90s around the same time. And you might think that someone like Clive would be, very aloof to these new kids just appearing out of nowhere. He had no idea who we were. Couldn't have been more different, as you alluded to earlier. Once he knew you were a real snooker person who had the game in your veins, you were on his side, and he welcomed you and he embraced you. And we all just have so much to be grateful to him for, the three of us probably more than anyone else. And even as fans of the game, before we started working in it, we all had so much to appreciate, everything we'd given him. It's not enough, I always feel, to say when someone passes that we'll never forget them, because I really do think, as we've done today, every time we meet, which will hopefully be many, many more times, guys, over the years ahead, we will always remember him.